Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Theodore Roosevelt, and the focus is a heartbeat away. The year is 1900. Roosevelt is serving as governor of New York. He's actually very happy with the role, but there's a lot of talk about maybe him moving up to the vice presidency of the Republican nomination in an election year that was just dawning. See, Vice President Garret Hobart had died the previous November, and so the party was going to need to have a new number two under President McKinley, who was clearly going to be renominated at the top of the ticket. Roosevelt's not terribly interested despite all this talk. He likes being governor. He likes being the executive, the man in charge, and he doesn't think there's a lot for him there in the vice presidency. So in February of 1900, he makes a public statement. It is proper for me to state definitely that under no circumstances could I or would I accept the nomination for the vice presidency. Done deal, right? Well, not so fast. There were other things in motion, including by the gentleman by the name of Tom Platt. Platt was sort of the boss of New York, at least for the Republicans. He is now serving in the United States Senate. And he had figured out a way to get along with Roosevelt, but never really warmed up to him being governor because Roosevelt was independent. He was going to do what he wanted, and Platt wanted patronage back in his own shop where he could dictate to whatever governor he wanted what to do and who to give jobs, and so he was inclined to get Roosevelt out of his state. Well, Roosevelt was very popular, so he didn't want to cross Roosevelt, but if he could get him nominated for the vice presidency, then he would be gone and Platt would be very happy. So there's a lot of talk about Roosevelt behind the scenes as Platt is really trying to get the delegates in motion for when they gather in June in Chicago for their national convention. Now, there's a lot of momentum for Roosevelt, but there's two people in Chicago who don't want him to be the VP nominee. Roosevelt's number one. Number two is Mark Hanna. Hanna was the chair of the Republican National Committee. Now, Hanna was also the brains behind getting William McKinley elected in the first place, and Hanna doesn't like Roosevelt. He thinks he's a cowboy. He thinks he's sort of independent off on his own, would be uncontrollable. But the delegates are all foursquare in favor of Roosevelt. In fact, one reporter called the town Roosevelt mad. And emissary after emissary were coming to his hotel room to convince him that he must accept the nomination. Well, eventually he gives in to all of this flattery and says, okay, if nominated, I will accept. Hanna is still a bit reluctant. In fact, it takes not one but two telegrams from President McKinley basically telling him to stand down. He doesn't want a fractured convention. If the delegates want Roosevelt, it's fine with him. So Hanna removes his concerns, and McKinley is nominated by acclamation at the top of the ticket. Roosevelt is nominated by acclamation for the vice presidency. There is only one abstention, and that was Roosevelt himself. So now it's time to campaign, and now he's kind of excited about getting into the race. And so he asks Hanna for any assignment, and Hanna loads him up on speaking engagements around the country. And while McKinley's still doing his job as president, Roosevelt's the man on the stump. And he's pretty good at it, riling up that Republican base. He has a lot of good story to tell, too. There's prosperity in the country. The expansion of the United States and world affairs was going, and Roosevelt was a big advocate for this, so easy for him to talk about. The success of the war over Spain recently, lots of good things going on. There were also criticisms, though, of notes of imperialism under the McKinley administration as they had taken over Puerto Rico and Guam and the Philippines, and this was new territory and made a lot of Americans uncomfortable. Roosevelt on the stump says simply, the simple truth is that there is nothing even remotely resembling imperialism or militarism involved in the present development of that policy of expansion, which has been part of the history of America from the day she became a nation. That's kind of nonsense. It was imperialism. The United States had taken over these foreign lands. In fact, there was an insurrection against the United States going on in the Philippines because they didn't want the Americans there. The Americans were in control. They had the military power. It was imperialism. It was militarism, but Roosevelt didn't want to quibble with the words, and frankly, neither did the American people. They were happy with the direction of the country, and going up against William Jennings, Bryan, the Democrat, who Roosevelt called a thorough-paced hypocrite and demagogue. It was an easy victory for the McKinley-Roosevelt ticket. In fact, they beat Bryan by nearly 1 million votes, and in the Electoral College, 292 to 155, a convincing win. So what does Roosevelt do now that he's vice president-elect? Well, he goes on a hunting expedition off to Colorado, and one of his stories that he tells in a letter to his son Ted is about him and his dogs cornering a cougar. And so what does he do? He's vice president-elect. He takes out his knife and he goes right into the middle of the fight and kills the cougar basically with his bare hands and this knife to actually save the dogs who were being injured by this cougar. This was a man a heartbeat away from the presidency, but he was not about to change the way he does things. So Roosevelt is sworn into office on March the 4th, 1901 as the Vice President of the United States. Now, he quickly comes to realize why the nation's first Vice President, John Adams, once said about the office that it was the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived or his imagination conceived. Why? Because the Vice President had virtually no responsibilities. The only job he has from a constitutional standpoint is to be the President of the Senate, but the only job he could do there is to break tie votes. Other than that, the Vice President had no responsibilities, and for more than 150 years since the start of the Republic, well into the 20th century, Vice Presidents had no active role in the administration. They were really just an appendage, waiting around just in case something happened to the President. So Roosevelt takes his family, they go back to Oyster Bay for sort of an extended summer vacation, and he's starting to chafe under this new set of non-responsibilities because he's a very active person and he's always taken his roles seriously and pushed the envelope to get stuff done. And now he has no authority to do anything. And in fact, he's actually muzzled because he doesn't want to speak out against his administration, even though he is more aggressive in some policies than his boss, President McKinley. So he eventually concludes, similar to Adams, that the vice presidency is an utterly anomalous office, one which I think ought to be abolished. The man who occupies it may at any moment be everything, but meanwhile, he's practically nothing. This is not going to be a fun 4 years for Theodore Roosevelt. In fact, he's already thinking, how much longer can I put up with this before I can start planning my own run for the presidency in 1904? But then history intervenes and the world changes very quickly. Early September, again, 1901, William McKinley is going to the Buffalo Exposition, which is a World's Fair in Buffalo, New York. He gives an economic address on one day. The next morning, he and his wife go to Niagara Falls. And then in the afternoon of September 6th, he is holding a reception at the fair in what's called the Temple of Music. Now, there was plenty of security at the time. James Garfield had been assassinated only 20 years before, and presidents had finally started to accept some security details. He was surrounded, but nothing prevented a man who had a bandage around his right hand walk up to the president, extend his left hand, which McKinley embraced. He brings his right hand under the bandage forward, pulls the trigger, fires 2 shots into the belly of President McKinley. One hits a button and kind of falls to the side. The other penetrates, goes through the front of the stomach, through the back of the stomach, and embeds somewhere in his back. He goes down. They immediately call for doctors to come in. There's a surgical procedure, and McKinley's rushed back to a house where he is to recuperate. Well, word gets around the country very quickly. Roosevelt is one of many who converge onto Buffalo. Cabinet members, members of the media, of course, family and friends, and of course the vice president, all worried about President McKinley. Well, McKinley's mostly kept by his doctors in seclusion, trying to get his strength back, but each day seems to be a little bit better. And by about the 4th day in, he's actually taking a little bit of food, and people start to leave. They're relieved. They think everything is going to be fine. And Roosevelt is one of those who says, look, I don't need to hover over him. He's going to be okay. I'm actually going to join my family for vacation. And he heads to the Adirondack Mountains. And they're going to actually climb Mount Marcy on a 2-day climb. Well, coming down Mount Marcy, Roosevelt spies a messenger. And he knows this has to be bad news. And sure enough, the message is that McKinley has taken a turn for the worse. That night, Roosevelt travels all night to get to the nearest train station, and he finds out the next morning that McKinley died at 2:15 that morning. Immediately heads to Buffalo, where he pays respects to McKinley and the family. He then goes to the Ansley Wilcox home, and in Wilcox's library, he raises his hand high above his head and takes the oath of office in front of 40-some-odd folks who sees him become the next president of the United States. He's no longer a heartbeat away. At 3:36 p.m. on September 14, 1901, Theodore Roosevelt became the 26th president of the United States. He was just 43 years old, the youngest ever to hold that office. That is Theodore Roosevelt and a heartbeat away from the life of Theodore Roosevelt. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.